Where's the mute button now? Is that the mute button? Yeah.
Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be taking a look at energy performance contracting and how it can benefit your business. My name is Stephen Kennett and I look after the built environment and energy portfolio here at 2 Degrees. I'm delighted to welcome our presenters today. Joining us from Honeywell we have Mark Cook, who will be presenting in a moment, and also James Napier, who will be available in the question and answer session, both of whom have a wealth of experience in this sector. We're also very fortunate to be joined by John Harrison, Executive Director at Peterborough City Council, who will be talking about how they have implemented energy performance contracting. So today's presentations will last around 30 to 40 minutes, which will leave us with 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. Before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can submit questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A box on the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So just type in your question and press send, and then we'll wait until the end before answering as many as we can. As an aside, if you should have any technical issues during the presentation, please use the chat box on the side to send me a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So without any further delay, I'll hand over to Mark now, and he'll begin with today's presentation. So over to you now, Mark.
Thank you, Stephen. Good afternoon, everyone. Mark Cook, Sales Leader at Honeywell Energy Solutions. I'm joined by my colleague James Napier, General Manager of UK Energy, and of course John Harrison, Executive Director Resources at Peterborough City Council. What I want to do today is really just cover some basic principles, some building blocks of what we think good looks like. Having gone through a number of these in the UK and globally, I'd like to give a perspective of what we think works best. After we've gone through that, John will look to cover off a customer perspective and really look at the lessons that he's learned in going through the EPC process, and if he was to do it again, what would he do differently? And I think at the end of that, then between the three of us, I hope that we can answer any questions that you have. So really, what I'm looking at is it's food for thought in working toward and through an EPC. What are the fundamentals for success? I play a lot of golf, and it's funny. I play off a reasonable standard, and I had a lesson the other day because I was struggling. And when I had the lesson, the guy that was teaching me said, "Mark, you just need to move your hips 3 inches to the left." And that 3 inches actually transformed my striking of the golf ball. And I think looking at an EPC is similar in some ways, in that it is some of these basics, it is some of these simple things that actually can make all the difference. I recognize that there are a number of different ways of procuring an EPC. So some of what I say will be more relevant depending on how you actually choose to procure an EPC. But I hope within the few slides that I've got, there will be something that will be of interest. What I find really interesting is when we start talking to folks about EPCs is the generally extremely positive perception that we get from folks. And really, the feedback we get, this is so simple, it's a no-brainer. Why would you not do it? And actually, I think the case is if only if it was that simple. Excuse me, I'm just trying to change the slide.
Stephen, can you move us on?
Yeah, I'll move the slide forward, and then each time you want it moving, just let me know, and I'll control it at my end.
I think one of the interesting things about an EPC is that everyone really gets to grips with the basics quite quickly, in that it is about guaranteed savings. It is about using those savings, paying for an investment. But I think at an organisation level, to actually create a level of momentum, there is a shift in mindset that is actually required. And I think that mindset, that shift, is getting folks to understand that this isn't about technology. This isn't about buying the latest technology. You're doing some of the simple things that we normally associate with demand reduction. This is about guaranteed outcomes. This is about an achievement. It's about moving towards set goals and objectives. And I think that's something that, as we go through some of the slides today, I will look to highlight ways we can do that across the organisation, so that in effect we're able to get a much greater level of buy-in across the organisation or the business. I think it's also important to realise that this is about partnership. This is about working with another organisation for a length of time, and therefore consideration to how does a partnership look is really important, because over that length of time you will be going through a number of processes, a number of steps, key milestones that at the shortest possible time frame is going to be 6, 8, 9 months from start to finish. So again, it's about understanding that this is a step process of engagement. It's about understanding that because of the scale, that momentum is key, and it is very easy to actually lose momentum. And as I say there at the bottom, it is simple, but actually it is far from easy. And I think what I see is the core value of an EPC. It is actually a mechanism for transformational change once the mindset has shifted from pure technology to actually looking and thinking about the outcomes that you want to create for your business or organisation. Stephen, can you change the next slide, please? One of the largest challenges that folks seem to have around EPCs is getting the internal buy-in, getting enough support internally to make it happen. I think internal selling is a significant challenge. That may seem surprising, given that a lot of people think an EPC is a no-brainer. Irrespective of where you start in the business, getting a level of support across the business is really important if you're going to succeed in maintaining a level of momentum to see this through. Equally, it's a lot more than just looking at energy. It's about understanding the impact on your business and your organisation. And when you're looking at energy, it's not just about looking at demand. It's not just looking about retrofit and the schemes like lights that you can get done very, very quickly. It's really important to actually take an holistic view. And one of the things that we like to talk about with our clients is a low carbon roadmap, and really to understand that if you're going to look at an EPC, you need to take an holistic view, and you need to absolutely start with the assets, looking at reducing your demand. I think what's really important thereafter is actually to take some consideration to understand how you optimize your generation. And if you have a number of different supplies, generation, renewables, and you've optimized your demand, how do you manage that? How do you manage that day to day so that you as an organization get the best possible return, whether it's from using the energy yourself or whether it's returning to the grid? I think there are some simple mistakes or traps that folks get into, and I think the key one is the rush to reduce demand and look at short term. So very often we hear folks talking about, I only want to do something with a payback of 2, 3, 4 years, and that's fine. But in terms of an EPC context, what it does is limit your ability to leverage those short-term gains into projects that are more complex, more value, that in themselves have a much longer payback. So it's important to look at the whole piece with energy, not just the reduction in demand. And when you look at optimizing generation, again, is not to fall into the trap of rushing to do a CHP, for example, because what often happens, and we've seen this a number of times, is that people size their CHP on existing demand. They then go and do the reduction in demand and end up with an oversized system that is actually inefficient and not cost effective. I think the key for us when looking at the planning piece and looking at an holistic view of energy is to widen the debate, widen the context. We need to understand, how does energy have an impact on our business? This is really important if you're involved in a level of management where you are trying to create a business case, where you passionately believe that this should be done, but you need help in actually selling this to senior executives and other parts of the business that are involved in the decision-making process. So what's really important is making it relevant to the business. And one of the tools that we like to use is really to understand the business, but not understand the business purely in terms of energy, at least to start with. So it's about understanding your industry, your organization at a macro level, really getting to grips with what are your key industry drivers. And those, for example, can be increased levels of competition, imports, legislation, but what at a high level is affecting your organization. We then look to dive into what are your fundamental business objectives, what it is that you're actually trying to achieve. And then lastly, really get to grips with what are the operational issues that you're actually struggling with at the moment. When you have all of those, a really useful exercise is to then weigh that up around an EPC, weigh that up around energy and carbon, and look at how does an EPC, how does energy and carbon reduction make a difference to those key areas, in particular, the operational issues and the business objectives. When those two areas are aligned, then you're in a much better position to start formulating a stronger business case and be able to talk to folks in a lot more detail around the benefit rather than just talking about pure energy and carbon reduction. It's interesting, recently we had an example, it was a multi-million-pound contract in the private sector, interestingly, who was a landlord with multitude of office and industrial high-tech buildings. He was looking at a project of multiple millions with less than 5 years, and to all intents and purposes, this was very straightforward, was literally a no-brainer. But it was difficult to get through the business. In the end, the business was still committing to societal investment in terms of project size. And it wasn't until the client started to talk through the EPC in terms of lease values and lease extensions and capital value of the estate, through reducing the costs of the tenants. Clients were prepared to sign lease extensions, and this had a knock-on effect for the value of the estate. And once that was positioned in the business case, it came very much more meaningful to many parts of the business that we were involved in, and actually accelerated the approval and actually turned into a successful project. So internal selling is really important. I'd recommend looking at it in terms of a low carbon roadmap, end to end. But I'd also recommend that you look at it in terms of the impact on your business or organization as a whole. I think that way you're able to garner wider support, and you will create a sustainable momentum. Steve, if you want to go through to the next slide, please. So in terms of that momentum, the biggest pitfall that we see often is that we have very enthusiastic folks excited about EPC and really trying to make progress in getting things done. What we often find, and we have been guilty of being sucked into this, is that we get and do a whole load of work and only to find that the senior decision makers actually haven't been involved, and it's actually not something that was part of their plans. So engagement across the business, so that's breadth, but also at a senior level is absolutely paramount to getting an EPC to work. At the end of the day, you're not likely to be looking at an EPC with investments under £1 million. And no business or organisation, irrespective of guarantees, is going to get into projects of that size without some serious consideration. So my advice is engage early at the senior level. And I suppose linking back to my previous slide is where a low carbon roadmap and a level of business planning is crucial in getting that buy-in in the first place. When you take on board that engagement is critical, the next component is really all about leadership. These things don't work without a driving force. They don't work without serious effort and someone who is appointed to make things happen. The other thing is that ideally you would need a exec sponsor. It's amazing how many times we get involved in these when we come across issues. We may well have someone that's leading, but they hit roadblocks. And it is having that executive sponsorship that can make all the difference between success and failure. It's also really important to get to grips with your own decision processes. It's amazing how many times we come across situations where we believe we understand the decision process, the client believes they understand the decision process, but only to get to the 11th hour to find that actually there are a whole load of additional steps to go through and additional work that has to be done in order to get through the decision process. Most providers will test you on the decision process. It's something that providers want and need to be very clear on, and therefore I'd recommend that you spend some time and detail the milestones, the timeline, and the things that are actually required to get through the decision-making process. I think the most important thing for me here is engineering scrutiny. There is, I think, the need for an additional cost when working through an EPC. The providers will, to the best of their ability, provide to you a scheme that they think works. They will have put significant effort into that and believe that it will deliver the guarantees that they say it will deliver. My strong recommendation would be, whether it's done internally or whether you go to an outside consultant or an outside team of specialists, is to have that work looked over. And my recommendation is that that's done independently, but then also in face-to-face interviews between the consultant yourselves and the provider, so that you walk away with absolute confidence that what is said is going to be delivered will be delivered. I think that is really important. I think it's an additional cost that you should think about right at the start of the process and look to engage with someone that you believe will be able to offer you that level of independent guidance on the quality of engineering and the levels of guarantees that you've been given. As I said at the start, partnerships is a key part of this. And I think one of the things that folks really need to understand for their own business is what does a partnership look like? At the end of the day, you're going to be working with a business 5, 10, 15 years. And it's important that that relationship gets off to a good start and that momentum is maintained through the period of that contract. And therefore, I think it's important, first of all, that you understand in your own minds what partnership looks like, and that when you go through selecting a provider, that they culturally fit with your views of what partnership looks like. I personally recommend that as you work through the investment grade audit, I think that's a really good time to start defining partnership structures, start to talk about, once we've gone through the IGA, once we're in the process of delivering, how is our relationship going to work day to day? The diagram on the slide is a diagram of a structure that we recommend for some of our clients, and really revolves around having a partnership board in place, meeting quarterly, that is a decision-making forum for the partnership, through to the change boards. It's another level of management that meets monthly, to weekly operational reviews, to having people that are designated in roles to support the partnership. So I'd advocate a partnership manager, for example, certainly where the scale is sufficient to do that. And the other thing I would recommend is consider how you implement that partnership and the structure of that partnership into the end contract. And the sort of things that I would recommend then is detailing the structure, detailing the roles and responsibilities of key people that are involved in those different meetings, and actually then finding a way of measuring the success of that partnership. So what are the KPIs that are important to you, and how do you put them into the partnership so you can understand if the partnership is working or not? Because at the end of the day, the partnership and the success of the partnership is actually critical to the success of the EPC. Stephen, if you could change. Fundamental to the success of the EPC, as I said at the start, is planning and taking that holistic view, building that business case, understanding the impact on the business. If you were looking at EPCs at an operational level, then without doubt the most important aspect is the data gathering. Without the data, the provider is not going to be in a position to give you something that is meaningful or potentially accurate. And it's one of the areas that we see at the start of the relationship with the client that presents the biggest challenges. In looking at data, I think in your preparation, what you can do is at an early stage is really begin to get to grips with your portfolio. You know, really understand what is your disposal strategy. I mean, if you've got buildings that are unlikely to be with you within the next 4 to 5 years, then you really need to think very carefully whether they need to be in the EPC portfolio or not. That's not to say that they shouldn't, but I think they need to have careful consideration and have merit in their own right as to whether they're included. I think it's also important to get to grips at this stage is what form of payback are you looking for? What is the payback? Because the provider will want to know this early on, because as they get the data and they start to benchmark your data and they start to make some basic analysis around what is feasible, then the payback plays a critical component in sort of understanding the sort of things that they think they might be able to achieve. The other thing that's important is certainly for local authorities, is understand the portfolio that perhaps sits at the edge So by that I mean things like sports centres and leisure centres and swimming pools. Many of these things are owned by the council but operate under an operating lease and have different schemes for the payment of utilities, etc., etc. But there are means of including these type of facilities into a portfolio. The other consideration is, of course, schools and education. And a lot of that is governed around the quality of relationship that any local authority might have, but also, obviously, whether they're academies, whether they're maintained, etc., etc. All of these things need to be considered. I think on the data gathering, the other thing that I would say is important is really, are you looking for a business case that works for each individual building? For example, the reason I say that is that quite often you might have small buildings that are important to you, but on their own, the business case doesn't stack up in terms of savings. But because of the larger projects on other buildings, then those works can be included into the overall project. So I think it's important to understand whether you want each individual project, each individual building to stack up in its own right, or whether you're able to aggregate the savings across the whole portfolio and include works into the project. I think in terms of assessment, there are other things that you can be considering. M&E asset registers, the building plans, the electrical diagrams, the asbestos registers, all important. I think the key point on that list is backlog maintenance. The EPC provides a mechanism for attacking backlog maintenance. There are things that providers will be able to do and look at over the longer term that will help you with backlog maintenance. I think on that point, it's also an interesting consideration at this point is whether social impact is something that is important to your organisation, because through an EPC and through delivering and managing outcomes, it is possible to work with a provider and look at, through that partnership, how you actually create a social impact. And that might be employment opportunities, it might be apprenticeships, but all of the providers are open to those type of discussions and looking at how they can add additional value to the business or organisation that they're working with. This is the start of the process. This part of the process takes an awful lot of time and effort. I think many organisations that we've come across underestimate the work that's involved in the data gathering phase. So I would recommend that in appointing someone that's leading the initiative, that serious thought is given to how actually you are going to resource the data gathering, who is going to do it, who is going to pull together, how long it's going to take you, what data do you have already in place, and then start to address that, because this piece on a day-to-day basis is fundamental to the success of the EPC. I think that's my basics, my fundamentals there in terms of some of the learning that I've experienced over the last few years working through the EPC process. I think in summary, I would just come back to planning, have a plan, take a holistic view, engagement and leadership. Those are the things that really count, because this is a complicated process and it does take time, and without those things, things the momentum is going to get lost, and it's going to be very difficult to see a level of success. I'd like to hand over to John Harrison, just to talk through, John, as a customer, as part of Peterborough City Council, the lessons that you've learned, the advice that you'd want to give to folks that are going through this EPC journey.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I think to start off with here, I need to explain that unlike Mark and James here, I'm an ENPC virgin, and probably until 3 years ago, virgin around anything that was energy. And so, you've got a perspective here that is somebody more at the strategic level, but somebody that's been involved in the detailed part of this over the last few months. So this is a real life story, and our first set of contracts were put in place just before Christmas. So, this is hot as the press, how we feel and how things work and what you can do better. I think the first thing I'd start with is that every organisation needs to understand why they want to do an ENPC contract. Just because ENPC contracts sound like a no-brainer, and the salesman tells you a no-brainer, then, why do you really want to do it, and understand how it fits in with everything else that you want to do, whether that's around your property, use of energy, delivering services, in my case, to the community and customers. So you start with the very basics. Why do it? And just because it's there doesn't mean to say that everybody is a good thing for it. The second thing I would say then that follows very, very closely is the business case. For Peterborough, it's a leadership priority. We're one of the first environment cities in the UK, and a leadership aspiration to be home of the environment capital. So strong political leadership of the council's priorities. The second thing I would say, and forget that I'm working in local government here, because if anybody's working in the public sector, then nobody's got any money. Or turn around another way, even if you're working in the private sector, everybody struggles to hit their bottom line. And if you can get that added competitive advantage by saving money, then it increases the profitability of your business. But from local government perspective, we're on a burning platform. We're seeing reductions in our grant of 40%. We've got limited opportunity to raise council tax from our residents, finding it very, very difficult to raise money for new capital investment. And so really, if you look at where we're spending the money, and everybody says, well, okay, then you've got things like adult social care, it's a real hard cost, and children's social care. There's a real burning platform and a graph of doom around energy bills in organisations that if you neglect it, you're going to miss an opportunity to actually protect valuable frontline services. I think the third part of it is the environmental credentials that underpin the energy performance contract, and things such as the carbon tax savings and CO2. So you have to start realistically with a strong business case in your organisation of what you want to do in the organisation. If you've got that, then that actually puts really in place a lot of the fundamental building blocks that's going to take you through the next part of the journey. The internal governance part of it, at Peterborough, I'm very, very fortunate because a lot of the things that I'm going to tell you are vitally important are actually in my own personal control or in my department. But firstly, I'm the council's finance director. I would say I get ENPC contracts. What I find is talking to colleague finance directors, they don't actually understand ENPC contracts. And matter of fact, picking up on Mark's point about being no-brainer, there's a degree of skepticism that something can be so simple that you can invest money, get a guaranteed saving, and it's going to cost you nothing. And matter of fact, actually, if the energy saving guarantees are beaten, you're actually going to make some money off it. It's a very, very difficult concept for FDs because nobody believes you. And I think it builds on some of the work that the Energy Managers Association is trying to do at the moment, that not just in the public sector, but in the private sector, that FDs actually have to understand energy, and EMPCs are just such a vital tool. And if you can't get traction in a council at the moment with an FD, when you've got reduced resources, increased demands, services under pressure, then actually we're not getting the message out. Similarly, the other parts of the organisation that I think are vitally important have to be signed up to it, and that's the legal team and, in effect, the property teams. I think a lot of EMPC starts with those people at the bottom, and that the people that really understand EMPC find the difficulty of getting that credibility in the organisation, and that property people are really undervalued, and actually we should be listening to them a lot more to understand how we can drive even more value out. I think it's also important that you understand some of the users of the services in question. Schools, for myself at Peterborough City Council, are a major issue in terms of making sure that we get the right engagement with schools. We've got to remember that schools are individual, autonomous bodies that have their own decision making, and how the council actually engages with them is vitally important, particularly with the increasing number of academies that are around. But also when you've got third-party organisations delivering some of your services. In Peterborough, we have a leisure trust, so it's important to establish the relationship with them who are delivering services out of major energy-consuming facilities, such as leisure centres and swimming pools. You've got to really engage both internally with some of the wider stakeholders as well. What I would say, though, is if it's going to work, how will it work in any organisation? Information, information, information. If you've got that information right at the very start, you're going to save yourself a lot of pain here. You need to know what your utility bills are. You need to know the status of your properties. You need to understand what the future services are going to be that the organisation is going to commission and where they're going to commission it from. Or you're going to be left with a difficult decision at the end about how do you make a decision around investment if you don't know how long you're going to have the asset for. Some of the things are very, very difficult in this tight financial climate, but you've really got to get the best information out. The next thing I would say is prepare for the whole process. Right at the very start, sit down as if this is a new member of staff starting. Sit down with your chosen contractor as part of an induction process and understand the process from start to finish, understand what the roles and responsibilities are, who's going to have to do what, and in effect, do your own audit and say, well, actually, have I got the resources? But even if I've got the resources, have I actually got the skills within the resources that are here? You don't want to start on this journey if you actually can't resource it properly, or at some point in time, you'll be in the journey and it will stall, which is not going to be good for anybody. You need the person at the top that's going to drive this through. If you haven't got the senior owner at the right level, then an EMPC will never work in your organisation. And you'll come across issues in terms of process, in terms of what-if scenarios. And if somebody isn't going to take that leadership forward, then it similarly won't happen. I think Mark talked about the aggregation. This is important as well. A lot of big EPC contracts in the past have been around, say, health facilities and that. Now, with health, you've got a single user. If it's, for example, in a hospital, you've got multiple owners and users of assets here. So if we take, for example, do I aggregate up an energy performance contract that links together schools with, say, a town hall? Well, the first question is, schools like working together, but will the head teacher of school A willing to bail out the head teacher of school B if one's overperforming and one's not performing? What I can probably guarantee is that the head teachers won't be willing to bail out, for example, a town hall that may not be underperforming. So we've got to be very, very careful about who's going to take the ownership, the accountability, and the delivery of the savings, and making sure that people are fully aligned on that journey at the start. Once you've gone all the way through the process, I would say to get to a point where you're going to do decision making, make sure that you have open dialogue all the way along. There's no point in saying, well, okay, then we're waiting for point X in the process, and at that point in time we'll have a discussion because we know the outcomes. Keep the dialogue boxes open. Things may come up from your end, or it may be some opportunity that you've never even thought about that the contractor's going to come up with. You know, keep your eyes and ears open. Keep those opportunities there for the art of the possible, because you never know what benefit may have come out of it. But during that process, there will be key points in the decision making where you're going to actually have to make real decisions. And at various points, you're going to have to say, yes, I want it. And if further down the line you change your mind, it's going to cost you money. Similarly with the contractor, if they promise you to do something at some point and they can't later down the line, then you don't get signed up for those issues. But be very, very clear at the key point. You will be into putting some money, some real skin in the game. Now, if you're going to get your decision making right, what's going to help you? And apologies for those that believe that this is a bit too local government, but I make no apologies for it, because I think one of the things that I would say is that as part of any induction process, that the contractor and whoever is the host organisation is clear about the decision-making process. And in local government, it does have its own little subtle nuances in that. So where do you start with? Well, where I started with was, before I awarded even the first contract, was get my scrutiny members. So those are the ones that sit a bit like in Parliament, that scrutinise the decisions of the government. Well, I got them to look at the contract before I was even going to award it, to tease out any issues they may have. So at that point in time, I have a certain level of clearance and authority to take things to a next level. What level of decision making will you get in terms of your delegation, or before you may have to go back to members? If you have to go back to members, how quickly can you go back? Have you publicised the fact that you're going to make that decision in, say, a few months' time, so that you're doing all the forward planning? Are you quite clear that you've got the position lined up in the future, and that meetings may be available to make a decision? Individuals are available for making the decision. So really, start planning for the future. And one of the things that I've tried to make sure that happens here is that EMPC at Peterborough fits within the overall council's budget and policy framework. So next week, after a long time since January, where Cabinet have been deciding what their priorities are, how they're going to balance the budget, what unfortunately some of the service reductions are going to have to be, we have the big meeting of the full council, where they finally set the council tax. But importantly within that, what they'll do is agree the amount of money that I've got available for key projects such as this for the next 10 years, what the capital programme is, what the capital strategy is for the organisation. Very, very importantly, what the asset management plan is, because that helps you drive some of the decisions and knows a degree of certainty how long you may have assets. And the final part of it is it's all within my overall treasury management strategy on how I may raise investment. And at some point in time, you need to decide whether you want to raise that investment or you want the private sector to. There are choices. And at what point in time then will you make the decision about how that money is going to get paid back, what the energy savings guarantee is going to be, what your appetite for risk is to get that money paid back. And that's all the easy part, to be perfectly honest. You know, you're then into, well, okay, then you've pressed the order and, you know, somebody's put in a bit of technology in. I'm not an expert in technology, so there's put in a bit of something. But there's then, in my case, a 15-year contract. And how do I work strategically in partnership with that contractor? You know, how do I know, is it working? And from my perspective, I'm setting up a position where I have a group, and including myself, I will have 2 elected members. So we can look at what's happened, is it working? How will continuous service improvement come forward? So what happens in 2 years' time? If there's suddenly something else that can happen that's going to save even more money, because I'm certainly not going to turn that one away. And then how we're going to look for the future, how we're going to look at rolling this out differently, and how can it really be of benefit to the community. So what I would say to you is, you know, be very, very clear around why you want to do it. Be very, very clear around how you're going to do it. Make sure you make timely decisions. Make sure you work very, very closely with the contractor. And remember that after that day one, you're both in it together for another 15 years. And it's a bit like a marriage. You know, you're in it for the long term. Don't start looking at break clauses sooner than later. Make sure you're both together there. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Stephen, I think that's about right for time. I think we've about 15 minutes for questions.
Yeah, so great. Thank you very much, Mark and John. So for the Q&A session now, we've got Mark, John, and also we're going to be, we'll get through as many questions as we can now. We've also got James who's available to answer questions. So I think to begin with, it would be quite interesting if someone's asking John if you could just give a bit more detail about the projects which you are running with your EPC.
Yeah. I think there are several ones, and some of them that may not be as obvious to people that are looking at it. So the first one is that we're looking at what I would call a typical project around investment at the town hall. A lot of it around how the lighting works and everything else. So you might think, well, okay, that's a very, very typical one. Now, if anybody owns a town hall, which includes multiple committee rooms, a massive council chamber and everything else, something that may be then let out occasionally at weekends for wedding fairs or an annual train event, then the first question is, how do you know what your actual usage is going to be so you can actually set the baseline? You know, how good the data. So what we found on this one, for example, is we know what the energy bills are. We knew when the committee rooms were probably open, but actually drilling down into their actual usage, whether the lights may be switched on, etc., was very difficult. So that was, in effect, something that was sort of, I would say, very, very simple to look at. Probably the easy one was a multi-story car park. Something that we're looking to probably regenerate after 6 years. So we didn't look at a 15-year contract on this one. And very, very good energy savings and maintenance savings. So they came out of it. I think the more different ones we had were around some of our leisure services. So what we actually established was around the plant and equipment at some of our swimming pools. The existing way we'd operated them required basically a capital change about every 5 years. And Honeywell came to the table with a proposition that basically said, try this different technology. You won't need to replace it every 5 years. And by the way, actually, you'll save real money throughout the process. So it was something, rather than, let's say, energy saving, it was something that was very driven as well by a cost avoidance. So those are the sort of typical ones that we started with, and we're now rolling it out into areas around schools, and we're working on something I think is major for the authority and very, very exciting, which is the effect the heat and energy strategy for the whole district. So I don't know whether that gives you at least a bit of flavour.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thanks for that, John. So another question we've got come in, and Mark, I'm not sure if you want to tackle this one, but someone's talking about other types of contracts, such as energy savings agreements and managed energy savings agreements. Are there particular success factors for these over energy performance contracts? And maybe can you just sort of spread a bit more light on those?
Stephen, it's James. Mark's delegated that to me. I haven't come across either of those types of contracts. I guess making a slight assumption here is if they are an energy savings program that is supported by a guarantee of savings from the contractor, they may just be an energy performance contract by another name. I know some contracts can tend to include an energy procurement contract as well, but to be honest, I haven't come across either of those two acronyms.
Great. Thanks, James. Another question here is, what is the scope for SMEs using energy performance contracts for contracts less than £1 million?
This, for me, is a real major issue. And what I'm trying to get to a position with and working with Honeywell is literally the answer to this question. And is there, for example, a community leadership role where the authority may seek to aggregate, works across varying number of SMEs, it may be in different locations and that. So, for example, at the moment, although it's not directly an SME, I'm looking to potentially sponsor work around a private theatre in Peterborough, which would be something completely different. But I think the real issue around SMEs is not so much about can you stand over some of these investments, but actually do SMEs actually understand EPCs and have they got sufficient people trained up to actually understand the management of energy? I'll let James and Mark comment.
Yeah, and I think the and I guess to make a slight distinction, we kind of said a relatively flexible £1 million, just because it gives an opportunity, one, for a wider scope of interventions to be considered, but it also starts to drive some of the return on the investment of the time and effort that customers take in actually procuring one. If there's an SME that doesn't have the scope for a project of £1 million, there are some EPC light type projects or guaranteed retrofits where for sure people will enter into probably a narrower range of interventions that the lower value can actually justify. So we're kind of being fairly specific about a large scale long-term energy performance contracting partnership, but again, for smaller organisations there is a route to achieving savings in partnership, but probably on a slightly restricted basis.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question here is, typically what sort or what percentage of energy savings are you looking at achieving through an EPC?
The obvious answer to that is it all depends. I mean, we can see, again, we come across very few customers that have done nothing, and a lot of people tend to have looked at lighting, some boiler upgrades, voltage optimization has been a very popular intervention. Even so, we tend to see somewhere between 15 and 30% of energy savings, but John can comment on the savings that he's seen.
Yeah, this is very interesting to me because that question you've asked is the question everybody says, how much can we save? And the simple answer is that nobody can tell you without starting to do a bit of due diligence and actually understanding where your baseline is. And I think, to be perfectly honest, if any firm walks in without getting any decent amount of information and gives you a guarantee, you should show them the door.
I think I might just comment on that as well, is that when you look at the low carbon roadmap, you get a solid 20 or so % from the basic asset type stuff. But it's really when you start to move into the decentralized energy, the CHP, the renewables, couple that with a level of management, that you can begin to see some sizable growth.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question is, what are some of the typical issues that create disputes in an EPC, and how can these be mitigated?
I think, and John, obviously from a customer side, will comment on it. I think the things that tend to cause disputes are broadly if there's not enough thinking having gone into the contract to start with, and also enough analysis. So if you start from a wrong baseline, you will get wrong measurements on savings. If you don't fully understand and work with the customer and say, what are the operational objectives you want to achieve, then there is a chance that the customer will end up with more energy efficient buildings that don't actually suit the way that the users of those buildings need to access services or areas of that building. So it tends to be largely around a lack of common understanding of the guaranteed outcomes. And the guaranteed outcomes aren't just savings, they are actually, this is the way that operationally I have to run my facility. And we do actually see that a lot of kind of facility improvement measures and operational improvements to facilities can be built into the energy performance contract as well.
Yeah. I would endorse everything that James has said. I think the other issue that I would say that can lead to not disagreements, but potential misunderstanding is commonality of language between the public and private sector, that we're all actually talking about the same thing. And because of the subtle nuances, being clear what one party is saying and actually what another party is believing they're saying, and vice versa, and getting that clarity right at the very start so people don't disappear on what they believe is a joined-up journey, but actually is starting in different directions right at square one.
Great, thank you. Someone else is asking, can you just elaborate a bit on some of the funding options which are available?
Yes, certainly, and certainly for the contract that we've set up. What I wanted to actually do is have complete clarity that there was no one single route for funding, and so a local authority may want to use its own internal resources, and I say internal resources because some authorities are very, very tax rich. They may use Public Works Loans Board, in other words, borrowing from the government or bonds market. So it may be the first route is the local authority will provide the funding. As part of that, there may be some grants that local authority may be able to get that will feed in, that will mitigate the impact of the needing to borrow. So, for example, how you may, for example, be able to feed in SALEX funding or other grants that may be around, depending on the nature of the facility. And then the final extreme is that actually you don't actually want to put any of your money in at all, and that you're quite happy that the private sector provide that funding, provide that level of risk, and as a result of that, what you actually will find is there will be a cost of capital higher than what it will be if you provide your own funding. But the reasons you do it, you're quite clear and you understand that the risk profile changes throughout that.
Great, thank you, John. I mean, a follow-up question to that, someone else is asking, are public sector projects typically done on or off balance sheet?
You know what, I'm the worst person you could ask that question to, because if I'm working in the public sector, as an FD, it doesn't really bother me whether it's on or off balance sheet. What I'm interested in is the outcomes. Now, some authorities are actually interested in making sure that the headline external borrowing is kept to a lower level, so I focus around trying to get off balance sheet solutions. I'm not bothered, to be honest, but it's up to individual FDs how they want to actually try and take them forward. But in the public sector, does it really make a difference?
I think if I can add to that we see an awful lot of people investing a lot of time and resource in trying to attain off-balance sheet financing, and we see the odd success story. Largely, in my experience, they are difficult to repeat, and also I'm yet to find anybody that will guarantee that even if they achieve off-balance sheet finance at the start of a contract, that it will remain off-balance sheet for the duration of that contract. And all of the changes that we're seeing in things like IFRS accounting standards are all designed to make moving financing off-balance sheet more difficult.
Yeah. I mean, in local government, quite simply every year, as the FD and referred to at the moment, is the Treasury Management Strategy. Your Treasury Management Strategy basically says if you want to borrow this amount of money, one of the indicators is, can the council afford to pay it back? And does it look a decent proportion of your level of council tax you're raising? If your advice to the council is, yes, you can afford it, and yes, it's reasonable, then why do you actually need it off balance sheet?
Great. Thank you. So I'm conscious of time, but if we can just try and squeeze in a couple more questions, that would be great. We've got one here around partnerships. So what contract types were considered and chosen to enable these partnerships to take place?
I think the contract is probably a relatively standard EPC contract. We entered into I guess an install and in some aspects a service contract that had a measurement and verification requirement annually within it, and that contract set out our requirements of the scope of works that we would have, the level of guaranteed savings in terms of kilowatt hours and carbon tons, and then the basis of us measuring and proving those savings. So it was a relatively straightforward construction and service contract, for want of a better definition. The partnership is embedded in the nature of us having to deliver a guarantee for the length of the contract.
Yeah, from my perspective, partnership is an overused term, and I try not to get into the legal parts of why you call it a partnership and that. It's more about the period of time that you're working with somebody, having aligned aims. So this is probably the fourth partnership I've got in place, a strategic partnership. And the features of being that it's not short-termist. So one is 30 years, another is 23, another is 20. My partnership with Honeywell is 15, is 8 years. And if you allow for the interventions, that maybe another 15, you could be seeing that for 23 years. Now, that sets a new dimension about how you work together with people. It's not a short-term, sharp, shock, in and out, you do that, go away, fine. You know, you have to work with those people and you actually have to believe that they're the right people for your organization. And that, for me, is the culture of the partnership, not the legal arrangement that underpins it.
Great. Thank you, John. So just one final question here. Who pays for the cost of setting up the contract and developing the deal, and then the ongoing management of that?
Well, there is, I guess there are two sides to that. One, in terms of developing the proposition for an EPC provider, it's a step process. So most providers will do an opportunity assessment at their own cost and their own risk, which gives an outline proposal. The customer then enters into an investment grade audit, which is payable on successful conclusion by the supplier if the customer chooses not to go ahead with the contract. If they do go ahead with the contract, those costs are built into the overall contract value. If the supplier fails to meet the requirement of delivering an IGA proposal that is commercial, then the customer has the right to walk away. So in terms of the costs of getting physically into an EPC, then there is a stepped approach, and we would very much encourage a customer not to contract to an IGA unless they have every intention of contracting that proposal at the end of the IGA process. The IGA shouldn't be a further investigation. It should be the first step on a commitment to a contract. And then in terms of the other costs, in terms of negotiating, there will be legal costs and I guess resource allocation costs on both sides. There is an embedded service contract for measurement and verification. That measurement and verification can be assigned to the provider of the MPC, or indeed contracted out to an independent party, but ultimately the costs of measurement and verification will be set against the energy savings that are attained in the contract.
Great, thank you. Just one final question. Mark, you mentioned in your presentation the example of the landlord, and someone was asking how exactly did the energy performance contract in that example impact on the valuation?
Because the contract gave the level of energy savings that required, that resulted in the tenants were able to be charged less for their utility costs on the site, and that then created an environment where they were prepared to enter into lease extensions. And once the lease extensions were signed, that obviously affected the value of the estate on the open market.
I think when you look at the future, I think the real issue is going to be, and I know as a council I'm sitting as a commercial landlord here, that how am I going to satisfy the need for green leases when the Energy Efficiency Directive comes through, and what's going to be the impact on market values and rental levels for those people that haven't actually got the green leases. And the EPC will be a valuable tool to make sure a lot of people who are landlords can get to that position and not get bitten when the market drops.
Great, thank you, John. So that's all we've got time for now, but I'd just like to thank Mark, James and John for their time today and for getting through so many questions, and also for everyone who joined us for this webinar. Just to remind you all, a recording of the webinar and the presentation slides will be archived on the 2 Degrees platform. So I hope you found today interesting and useful, and you'll be able to join us again in the future for further webinars. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.